we've seen quite a few early cartridge weapons dusted off for the Great War. So let's carry on and see one more today, with a once exceptional but now obsolete handgun still in the fray. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the French Revolver Modèle 1873, a Chamelot-Delvigne. Let's get a look in the light box. At a little over 9 1/2 inch in length, this isn't the largest revolver we've seen, but it still weighs in at 2.5 pounds, making it very stout. It has a 6-shot cylinder, which chambers the 11mm French ordnance cartridge. Now once again, since this is a history show, we have to take a couple steps back before we can take one forward. And in this case, we're talking about a handgun that was still kicking around for the World War, 1914-1918, and yet the model name has it all, 1873, so we are going to have to turn pretty far back. And we'll start with Mr. Delvigne. Gustave Henri Delvigne had been born in Hamburg in 1800. He joined the French army young and reached the rank of captain in the Royal Guard. He would resign during the 1830 July Revolution. Probably a smart move. Before that, he had already started his arms development career, with an 1826 muzzle-loading design focused on deforming the loaded ball to better engage rifling thanks to a narrow chamber. He further experimented with conical rounds, and had he stuck with it, he might have actually beaten out the mini-ball. He also developed a Rampart gun for the French military, which was a breech-loading black powder monolith, although his musketoon of the same year was rejected along with a few other ideas. Now, I didn't see anything about his political leanings during that time, but being part of the Royal Guard and with the upset, it's not a bad idea to take a break from the military, and some of his designs, yes, may have been adopted, but most were not, and I think he was just getting a little tired of armed services. So, Delvigne would turn his attention towards commercial revolver design. That's sort of the big industry at that time. Revolvers were not necessarily new technology, but they were hitting that sort of peak in their development just before the modern revolver as we understand it today. A lot of things were being invented, and it's a good place for expansion and a good place to find some patent work. And in part of that, he would join up with a Belgian arms maker by the name of J. Chamelot. And that's about all I got. I seriously couldn't even find this guy's full first name. Just a brief mention of his previous employ with the arms maker Reinhart. But Delvigne must have relied on him heavily as he got first billing on the gun. Presumably, this was another big picture, small picture matchup we see so often. Delvigne probably would have been the big idea and system man, and Chamelot was most likely the engineer, making it actually line up and work, seeing it through prototypes. Anyway, we now have the two men working together, regardless of how much we know about one of them. And they are developing a revolver. Very specifically, they start around 1858 dropping patents, and they're improving every other year in terms of following the patents that they are indeed dropping. And what they're leading towards is a good, compact, reliable, pocket, personal revolver. These took on a number of variations I will not be covering today, but they eventually evolved into an incredibly simple action for the time, single and double action gate loading pin fire system with an offset hammer to allow for lower profile sights despite the pin fire mechanism. These were produced by the brothers Pirlot in Liège, and they did all right in the market, but as years passed, Delvigne could not resist thinking like a military man and pursuing the all too lucrative military contract. So Monsieur Chamelot and Delvigne took their patents and applied them towards a larger, fuller framed military pattern revolver. And in this regard, remember this is the pinfire era, they went with the French Navy's 12mm pinfire cartridge as their basis for the military pattern, and they also produced a bet hedging 9mm version as well, and both of these were what they would present to the French authorities to say, look, I am back to designing martial arms, and these are superior to what you're packing now. Again, this pistol was more of a layout change. It used the same basic action and patents of the original pocket design, just set out in a way that you could actually use on horseback. It features both single and double action and that offset hammer previously mentioned. Loading and ejection were on the left side with a manual ejecting rod mounted to the barrel. Now, I know this doesn't look too advanced, being pinfire with an open top, but the internals were top-notch and dead simple for that time. They would remain nearly unchanged until our gun today, so I'll ask that you reserve judgment for now. The resulting system patents appeared starting in 1862, but the gun would be trialed by the French Pistol Commission in August of 1867. And that really only happened at the insistence of Napoleon III. Following French experiences in the Crimean War and the Mexican intervention, French officers took note that the British and American-made revolvers were fairly impressive by their own hodgepodge of often still percussion-capped weapons. It sparked a wave of private purchases, particularly by cavalrymen. So good old Charlie ordered a commission set up at Vincennes, with a mission to study possible martial revolvers, with an eye towards universal adoption. This was hopefully going to clean up this mess of models and calibers all over the French forces. Anyway, 1867, the French officials get to look at the open-top pinfire Chamelot-Delvigne, the precursor to this gun. And they like it a lot. It's very accurate. It's very simple for the time. It's durable, again, for the time. It's smooth. It's sensible. And the one thing that really stood out for them is that it used a side plate to access the internal mechanism. And I know that seems odd to say because it seems so obvious now, but at the time, most of these revolvers would have been solid frames with sort of maybe like a cutout portion under the grips. And then if you wanted to like put springs in or out or oil it, you'd have to kind of reach in. I mean, I've rebuilt Webleys and things like that, and they're set up that way. They don't have a side plate, so you have to like get in there and sort of arrange the springs like a ship in the bottle. You just place everything, set pins, and it's locked in. It's all blind work, and it's a pain in the keister. So when you're for the first time experiencing a revolver where you take off 2 or 3 screws and the side of it just comes off and you just see everything laid out before you to check for function, to oil, to see if there's any wear, that's brilliant, especially from a military perspective. That's simple and quick. It makes it easier on your field armorers, yada, yada, you get the point. So that part knocked them right out of the park. That would stay on their minds throughout the rest of the trials. But it doesn't mean that the gun was adopted right away, because they were also looking at other designs that were new from Le Faucheux, Perrin, another big name, and Adams. These are guns that they've got their own beautiful features that we are not going to go into today. They kind of slow the commission down. They're going, wait a second. Do we really want to make this investment blind? Let's take a look. Let's take a look. And again, this is kind of famous for French's death by committee. They want to just be absolutely sure to the point of delays. And so in this case, I have to give the French one piece of credit, which is that you're on the verge of the metallic cartridge center fire era. And what they were looking at the time were pinfire. So if they had adopted fast, well, they might have adopted wrong. So good on them for holding off, but it does create one particular problem. The goddamn Prussians. That's right, the Franco-Prussian War, which we've lovingly covered before with our rolling block episode, took a lot out of the famous French ego. Handguns had especially been neglected, and while a few gendarmerie and Navy Le Faucheux had wandered in ad hoc, the majority of available pistols were still single-shot percussion models. Again, like our rolling block episode, France would have to turn to the US and buy up whatever it could get its hands on. This mostly meant stocks of cap and ball Colt and Remington revolvers, already dated technology for a heavy expense and still a military defeat. As we well know, this conflict would finally solidify the French will to actually improve their armed forces. And so we see things like the adoption of the Gras instead of the Chassepot rifle. Part of this delay, though, in the war actually also put our heroes, Chamelot and Delvigne, in a better position for the next trials, because that gave them time to fully consider an update to their system and integrate it to new centerfire technologies and a stronger frame, yada yada. Remember, before open-top pinfire, not the best system. But by 1871, when the Pistol Commission is back at it in full force again, ready for an immediate adoption, they've got something much better looking. And it had to be pretty slick because the French requirements were, for the time, insanely strict. They demanded that it may not be a break-open design. This is probably pointed at the old Galand. We'll get there in a moment. It must be solid, one complete piece, no little accessories to bend or lose. The cylinder must be easily removed for cleaning. The loading gate must be simple, easy to use, and cannot open inadvertently. The ejector rod must be strong and impossible to snag and bend. The pistol's accuracy was going to be judged at 25 meters, but they still wanted a nice flat trajectory, making a 50 and 100 meter shot possible. The ammunition was to be a centerfire metallic cartridge. They wanted a half-cock notch. This may not have been a half-cock safety as we know it. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's more of a manual rebound position. More on that in a moment. It must be single and double action and feature simple, strong lock work. It must have an inspection plate for easy cleaning. That goes back to that disassembly plate. You must be able to disassemble it without any additional tools. And, importantly, the springs must be simple, strong, and easily reproduced or repaired by average tradesmen. Now, none of the entrants would meet every standard of the competition, so it became a bit of a guessing game as to which points to focus on. So let's look at what Chamelot and Delvigne cooked up. Preserving the simple action, they had gone to centerfire. The top strap now meant that it was a solid frame revolver with more strength for modern cartridges. Moreover, it was further upgraded with a simple, rugged loading gate. It had a capped ejector rod sheathed safely away to prevent bending or breakage, and a simple push-button release for the central rod to free the cylinder for cleaning. Plus, that disassembly plate was simplified down to one single screw. Now let's take a moment and finally get a quick look at the internal action. We have a 3 flat and 1 V-spring working setup. The hammer runs off a large mainspring and the sear off a smaller one, also set in the grip. The trigger, also doubling as a cylinder stop, has its own V-spring. The hand is pushed forward by another small flat spring pressing against the inside of the action cover. Now this may seem a bit complicated to us, but we've seen the Bodeo. Remember, this mechanism existed over a decade before the Colt Lightning, which I would compare for you right now, but I spent an hour trying to sort it out from diagrams, and then I had to see an optometrist and a therapist for another 6 hours to get myself sorted back out. As far as I can tell from the trials, there was only one simpler action than the Chamelot-Delvigne, and that was provided by Charles-François Galand, another big name in revolver development. But I am not going to go into deep detail on his personal history today. I just want to say very influential, very interesting man. But let's take a look at what exactly he had put into the competition. We mostly think of his simultaneous ejecting 1868 pattern, but remember the French trial said no break opens specifically because of this gun. So just like with Chamelot and Delvigne, he had taken his action and applied it to a solid frame gate loader layout to fit the trials. And it was pretty neat. No tools needed to disassemble, and an internal action reduced to only 8 components. Actually, let's go ahead and take a look. See, much simpler than the Chamelot-Delvigne. And if this seems familiar to you, better take a look at our Colt New Army and Army Special episodes, because the Americans really did like the Galand action, with a little modification. So yeah, the Galand got a lot of attention from the committee, and the man himself was a well-known designer. He even went so far as to publish a book detailing his ultimate military revolver. The Galand de Guerre was beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it just didn't stack up as a military revolver against Chamelot-Delvigne for the French specifically. Number one, the ejector rod was a little weak and prone to damage, and that was a big no-no. For some reason, the French were very, very worried about this. In addition, while easy to disassemble, the components, the sort of springs and buttons you had to hit to get everything apart, they were complicated and therefore took more time and energy to mill and assemble, and honestly, it made people fearful that they would also get damaged, and it's more to replace on the gun if it takes damage. And then, on top of all of that, it was a little bit too compact, which is an odd argument and probably easily rectified, but it's something that stood out to the French. I don't know. So, the final peg, though, was the price. It was just a little bit more, well, maybe a lot more expensive to manufacture. It hadn't really considered exactly what went into every milling operation, and therefore, the good old C&D, the Chamelot-Delvigne, that thing was going to be cheaper by the unit. And that's a huge consideration when you're dealing with a very large imperial style army, pennies count. Plus, the Chamelot-Delvigne had already been adopted elsewhere during the course of the trials. This is the Swiss Model 1872, which would later evolve into the Model 1878. The Swiss had been keeping track with the same revolvers as the French, and had decided sooner that they appreciated the advancements afforded by Mr. Delvigne and Mr. Chamelot. At the same time, Italy was also considering the same revolver, but we'll get there in a moment. Now, I've laid this story out as a showdown between two particular designs and, well, three designers, but you get the idea. Realistically, though, this was a big revolver trial, and there were a lot of designs submitted with some interesting names. The problem is, it's a lot of detail to go into, and the guns are sort of evolutionary dead ends in some places, and it doesn't really help fill you in on this one. It's just nice to sort of see the sort of one best competitor against this gun and why you could do with a little less if it costs you a little less, yada yada. If you really care about this particular period, this set of trials, and I think it's an interesting period in history, check out the books that are listed in the description below, because they are full of full color photography of trials, handguns that are almost impossible to even find in the US. And it's a very nice little peek into sort of one of these last waves of developmental history to the revolver. The next little step is going to be swing out cylinders and things like that. But realistically, the mechanisms are really getting polished right in this period. Very good reading, very far outside of our scope today, though. So let's get back on track and talk about ammunition. This is the 11mm French ordnance cartridge, although I am showing you the load data for the sort of last iteration of it after the adoption of smokeless powder. The original was even weaker, and what we're looking at doesn't really beat out 32 ACP. I've tried walking back just why the French went with such a mild cartridge. I'm betting it was a combination of easy shooting and a fascination with phosphor bronze. You see, it's an alloy that is extremely corrosion resistant. As a matter of fact, it remained popular on ships' propellers till, I don't know, have they gotten rid of phosphor bronze? But anyway, very corrosion resistant, fairly strong alloy, although not as good as, later steel that we see in guns. And obviously, while an interesting side note in the development of handguns, it did not catch on. Still, the French and the Swiss and probably the Italians all tried out phosphor bronze cast revolvers and apparently did not go with them. But in the process, I'm sure they probably worked up this particular cartridge and then just sort of rode with it. Or I could be a little bit wrong. It's just a strong speculation from my point. Anyway, just because we have selected, or rather eliminated, all the competition and we're down to just the Chamelot-Delvigne, it doesn't mean that this is actually the adopted handgun of France at that point. Instead, we're going to see limited production, and it's going to be centered out of Saint-Étienne. The big production starts in 1873, which is where this gets its name, although realistically during that year, only maybe 60, 70 pistols actually got put out, and then more started carrying off in 1874. And what they were doing is they were gearing up for big extended trials. That means the gendarmerie, the chasseurs, the dragoons, and other things that I can't pronounce got to take the guns on field exercises. So the 1871 would become the Model 1873, which still underwent minor changes in that first year or less. Again, best to get into some heavy reading if you care about whether or not the screws were being drilled all the way through the frame or into blind keyways. That's a lot of detail for an episode like this. So full production really gets kicking in 1874, and that gives us our gun as we have it here today. So I think those of you who know the show know we can finally get a closer look. Hey, Revolver. Now just to recover, this is a hefty 2.5 pounds with a single kapow and double kapow action. Now you may notice no hammer rebound. That thing is flat on there until we start to cycle again. Now there is a manual half-cock position which it just managed to flow into, but that's not a safety position. So even if I, let's see, we'll drop this all the way through, I will manually set this into a half-cock. It is not a half-cock safety in sense of a mechanical manual safety. This is a don't fall on a primer kind of safety. And it's a system that realistically becomes automatic for most pistols around the same time that this one was adopted. We've seen it in other systems. And it's unfortunate that it wasn't represented here because it represents a big advance in safety. Now, it is a gate loader, and again, this predates our Abity system for the moment, which means that if we pull the trigger with the gate open, we're still going to be firing the gun. So when you load this, you pull to your position, you pull out your rod, which is kept by a cap here. It is very stiff, so I'm going to push up, forward, and grunt. There we go, grunt. Flip her around, she's back. We will manually align our chamber and our cylinder if we had a spent casing in there, and we will push it forward and then manually push it back. We will roll, align visually, forward and back. This is a tedious process. Nothing about it is automated for you whatsoever. I am sorry. So sorry to say. Now, the one good thing is that the pistol disassembles really easily. Let's take a look at that. So we got a big button. Let me get my patented plastic pokey doodad. Big button here. It looks like a screw, but it's also a button. When I depress this, it's going to free the axis pin for the cylinder, which is right here, to go forward. If I keep depressing it and going further forward, I can go past the second notch. The whole thing comes out. So you'll notice there's a projection on one side. That is actually a screwdriver. Oh, by the way, with the gate open, our cylinder, remember that was part of our terms, our cylinder is now free to slide out, assuming I actually pulled the ejector rod all the way forward and get it out of the way. There's a slight bit of spring pressure there, guys. Sorry, my mistake. So, cylinder pops right out. Part of our conditions for the trial, flip this guy around. The other part is that it had to disassemble with no tools. Well, this is what we've got. We've got our little projection, and it will key right on this screw here, and it will turn. Although, being a well over 100-year-old revolver, I don't really want to put any extra scuffs. So I'm going to go to a screwdriver and just go ahead and pop this guy out for you. It's also a lot faster than sitting there with a sort of right angle oddity and cranking it around 50 times. So we'll spin this screw out. This is the lone screw for disassembly. Do not lose it. This is the only thing to sort of get lost. The rest of this is tabbed into place. So there's our inspection plate, free and clear, and our grip comes free and clear. And we can see the internals of our action. Oh, look at that. So, if you want a quick preview before we get to the animation, it's just single. Ooh, hey. And then, without throwing springs everywhere, we'll try double. Hey! Very smooth, very functional system. And again, very easy to get in and out of and to get cleaning. So, honestly, this thing does everything the trial board wanted in the big picture. So, hey, no wonder it was adopted. But before we get too far into opinions, let's go ahead and get a better, closer look at how this works with an animation from Bruno. We'll load this revolver up one round at a time and take a closer look inside. The most unusual feature of the Chamelot-Delvigne is probably that claw-shaped pawl that sits in between the hammer and the trigger. In single action, the hammer pulls up on the pawl and therefore pulls back on the trigger and up on the hand. The hammer is held back by a sear, which is then released by the trigger. In double action, the sear is just cammed out of the way. Instead, that pawl lifts up on the hammer and then releases it automatically. Now, not pictured in this animation is the fact that there is a flat spring on the pawl. It just was a little bit hard to see, and it was available in our 2D comparison earlier. Unloading is equally slow. We're going to have to flip over our ejection rod and punch each case out one at a time. This looks fast in the animation, but you have to manually index each chamber into position. Alright, now let's get this over to Mae and let her try it out. A little slow to load, a little slow to unload, and definitely a mild cartridge. But remember, this predates the Revolver. I feel like I would take this over the Revolver. Anyway, this gun, official adoption August of 1874, and from then on until 1885, you're going to see roughly 350,000 1873s produced. It becomes over time, becomes the universal revolver of France. It replaces a myriad of smaller designs, because before this little guy, it was much more of an ad hoc system with different divisions and things taking what they needed and buying them in little batch lots. We've seen this before with other armies. This is really the modern handgun of France. Now, if you happen to have one that's dated after 1885 on the barrel, chances are it was a refurbishment at a later date. And certainly they didn't just go out of service at that point, although we'll get in that history more in just a moment. My sources say that these rang up a hefty 59 gold franc price tag, but a more expensive model 1874 would follow, costing 63.22. That's right, a more compact officer's model would be revealed in 1874, making it the model 1874. Guys, if you can't keep this straight, I can't help you. These were overall lighter, finer fitted, and deeply blued instead of a polished white steel like the 73. A total of 36,084 seem to have been produced, making it roughly 10 times as rare. To my knowledge, Army Model 74s have an N prefix in front of the serial. The Navy models have none at all. Although there are commercial and civilian examples of both the 73 and 74, so I'd check for a naval anchor mark on the butt as well, just to be sure. I should point out the Navy 73s and 74s actually came a little bit later, especially in the 11mm ordnance cartridge, because the Navy, well, they were doing their own damned thing. The French Navy does what the French Navy does, and it doesn't really particularly care what the Army does unless it gets a steep enough discount on whatever that thing might be. I mean, heck, they even skipped out on adopting the 1874 Gras. Instead, they'd go all the way up to the Gras-Kirkpatrick hybrid, which we will discuss later. For now, though, they had just adopted a modern revolver in the Model 1870 Le Fachot, with a much more powerful 12mm cartridge, on par with 44 Russian, way better than an 11mm ordnance. So why would they want the Army leftovers? Also, if we're being fair, the Army production was taking up almost all of the arsenal production at that time. So, as a few years go by, and the Army's wrapping up what it needs, well, maybe it's time for the Navy to start considering using that revolver. I mean, it's there, and they need revolvers, and if it's going to be super cheap anyway to get it from the government instead of private purchases, well, okay, fine, but we are keeping our 12mm cartridge. We are not messing around with that weak 11mm crap. So that results in the nearly identical models 73 and 74M. These are recognizable by the over-barrel marking M for Marine, or maybe Modifié for that special cartridge. They are exceedingly rare, as production from 1877 to 1886 encompassed only 13,188 73s and just about 1,500 74s. Like I said, these only lasted so long, and the Navy would take a number of 73s in standard 11mm ordnance, especially after the update to smokeless powder, making the 12mm cartridge a near non-factor for World War I. And speaking of smokeless powder, this little guy becomes a bit of an anachronism by the time it's released. I mean, like we covered earlier, no Abity. Gate loaders themselves are starting to be kind of not the cool thing, and not even a rebound position on the hammer, let alone a hammer block. This is a very old revolver in a lot of ways, despite its modern features. And so they start looking for a replacement about the time that they're coming out with smokeless gunpowder. We know in hindsight that will be the MODELE 1892, which we've previously covered. However, there would be a transitional model we have not covered in great detail. The 1892 history was one of our earlier shorter shows, and I'd love to address it again someday. Regardless, we're talking about production ending in 1885, and then we take a number of years to get to the 1892. There's a transitional model or two in between. People are done with this thing long before it's even replaced. It's no longer cutting edge, and in a lot of ways, it's fairly weak. But lucky for us, or lucky for the 1873, the French don't think handguns are all that important. So even with the adoption of the 1892, they never quite make enough of them to completely displace this revolver in service. And then, well, war were declared. So that means big, slow, and not very punchy gets to keep serving all the way through the Great War. The 11mm ordnance cartridge stuck around. The 1873 and 74 revolvers stuck around. And we've seen several episodes about massive influx of Spanish-made revolvers and pistols, the Ruby, nearly 1 million of those. And the 1892's on hand. And weirdly enough, look, the official handgun was the 1892, and they didn't even produce a single extra one during the war because they just went for Spanish handguns. Well, they weren't going to throw these guys out either. So you have two revolvers that aren't in production anymore that are serving in the lines, and I'd love to say it did an amazing job and people spoke about it, but I don't know of anybody that actually bragged about their Chamelot-Delvigne defending themselves. It's a slow loader, it's an awkward gun, but it was there. And then, honestly, even after the war, the French delayed on committees and honestly had blown a lot of money and didn't have a lot spare. These things stuck around all the way up until World War II, although by then you're mostly seeing it for things like rail guards. They're not, maybe an artilleryman here and there. They're not frontline weapons by World War II, but they still did not retire until post-World War II, which is insane to think something from 1873 was still kicking it around that long. Of course, I should also add, just while we're talking about these guns, France was not the only user of the Chamelot-Delvigne, and not the only one to retain it all the way up until World War I. That would also mean that this is the Italian MODELE 1874, an Italian Chamelot-Delvigne. Let's get this into the light box. Still weighing in at 2.5 pounds, this guy is 11.5 inches long. That is a big barrel. It has a cylinder with 6 rounds, this time chambering the 10.4mm Italian ordnance cartridge. That's right, folks. Italy, France, and Switzerland were gun buddies. They had been developing cartridges and looking at revolvers all together, all in a pile, and they all came to the same conclusion. And since Switzerland wasn't in the war, I don't have to worry about showing you a Swiss version of this. But I do have to show you the Italian. Now, these were adopted officially in March of 1876, and I think the most outstanding feature compared to the French is that long barrel, although there are some other differences. Now, this comes from focus on cavalry. In fact, the first extended trials were started with 10 cavalry regiments. They were later extended to infantry and alpine officers, then to the carabinieri. With the army happy, the Italian Navy would follow shortly, making this a near-universal issue handgun for the kingdom. Like with France and Switzerland, the Italians adopted their first centerfire handgun cartridge, and they went with big and weak like the others, sadly. The 10.4mm Italian ordnance cartridge started as a truncated cone black powder, but by the time of World War I, it evolved to a smokeless powder with a round nose and a thin rim at the base of the bullet to keep the muzzle speed up, minimizing drag and still engaging the rifling. We covered this a bit better in our Bodeo episode. Alright, so we have another handgun. Let's take another look. Zooming in, we'll see, let me get lined up, significantly longer than that French model, although to my hand it feels a little less chunky overall. So let's get that out of the way. Alright, so a couple things that stand out. One, our push button's not over here. Our disassembly push button is now, is now right here. Push that, pull the rod, same deal, except he does not have a screwdriver attachment on the rod. So you just have to have a screwdriver. Sorry, guys. Sights are a little taller, a little clearer. I particularly prefer the grip on this. This thing is really much more like the Swiss adopted 1872. I wish I had an example to show you today. Again, single and double action, and no rebound. It just sort of walks in as you give it another tug. Gate loader, no assistance, no abity, nothing fancy, guys. No spring back on the rod, works just like with the French. Realistically, I'm not showing you anything all that exciting except for the general profile and slightly simpler construction and the need for a screwdriver. So I guess the Italians didn't get the best deal in this exchange, except for, man, that barrel, I keep repeating this, is really slick. So let's see if it makes a big difference, though, by sending it over to Mae and seeing how she performs with the Italian model.
That's true. All I want is you. You're the sweetest rose that grows in Italy. Let me kiss your lips, touch your fingertips. Let me hear you say your love is all for me. Here on bended knee, listen to my plea. Come to me and be my rose of love-laden land where you dwell, and I long for your arms to entwine, when the whole world will know you are mine. Rose of Italy, won't you come to me? Won't you come to me? Across the sea, with a heart that's true, all I want is let me kiss your lips, touch your fingertips, let me hear you say your love is all for me.
I really like the size and layout of this particular gun. Maybe it's designed for gloved hands and I've got big meaty mitts, but it works out for me. Now, these guys were at first purchased in a 12,000 unit batch from the Pirlot brothers, the same guys who were selling the commercial versions and doing the trials guns for the Chamelot and Delvignes. Well, I mean, this is a Chamelot-Delvigne, but those guys cashed out pretty good before the Italian arsenal system kicked in, and Gazettette and the arsenal at Brescia, they took over production. Honestly, I couldn't find a total number, but it was much, much larger than that first 12,000. Those original Liège-made guns are much more rare than these. The gun served well with Italy, 1876 through the adoption of the 1889 Bodeo, which technically was supposed to replace this gun. We've covered this incredibly simple and rugged revolver before, but it's worth mentioning it did not completely displace the 1874. Look, the truth is the Bodeo was designed to be inexpensive, rugged, and idiot-proof. Folding trigger, later edition of a hammer block, original edition of the rebound position, still a gate loader in a time when it could have been a swing out, iron frame for cheap construction. I mean, we've talked about the Bodeo. The Bodeo is not designed to be better than this gun at shooting and fighting, and it used the same cartridge. It was designed to be a better military revolver in the sense of pennies and pounds. So, okay, well then that means that there's not really a reason to get rid of this. You don't have a clearly superior gun except for some vague hammer safeties, and this has a rebound position. It's just manual like we covered with the 1873, so if you're a sort of literate, self-possessed officer or cavalryman who has the training for this kind of gun, it's not a real danger to you. It's a danger to the infantrymen, which again, those guys had Bodeos. So a lot of cavalry deeply preferred this gun and didn't want to give it up. The extra weight, especially the extra barrel length and the very tall, clear sights, this is a better cavalry weapon than the Bodeo. So it stuck around. I mean, it kept being produced concurrent for a number of years. They wanted these, not the new guy. And so when the Great War rolls around, 1915 for Italy, these are still plentiful. They're everywhere. They haven't been retired or pushed out even half as much as the French 1873s were. So they were a common sight on the battlefield in World War I. And when you think about the fact that if you're Italian, your choices are, and we've gone over a number of these guns now, the Bodeo, this big old Chamelot-Delvigne, or maybe a Ruby, not as many, the Gazettette pistols, no thank you. Okay, but what about the Berettas? Okay, the Berettas are looking kind of nice. So maybe you would choose the Beretta handguns over top of something like this. Maybe you'd choose the Bodeo, but probably not over top of this unless you were just an accountant, you know. This is still a good Italian handgun for the war, and it still saw plenty of service. The Navy also retained their Chamelots, and some were even modified after the adoption of the Bodeo. These were pieces that were sent in to be repaired, but instead were, in a batch, gutted and reconfigured with Bodeo internals and the iconic folding safety trigger. The official retirement date for the 1874 was 1969, the same retirement date as its replacement, again the 89 Bodeo. This gun lasted all the way through the service life of the gun that was meant to put it out of business. That's fascinating. Now, that also might be a little bit of a testament to Italian industry. That means 2 world wars for this 1874 Chamelot, just as well as the French 1873. These are long-legged guns, well beyond their prime, still doing hard duty. Now, by the way, France and Italy were not the only ones to adopt a Chamelot-Delvigne pattern revolver. As we said, Switzerland had their own versions, along with the Greek 1874 and later 1884 Navy, the Serbian 1876, and the Swedish 1884 Navy. There are also some other designs that get lumped in with Chamelot-Delvignes from other countries, especially neutrals like the Netherlands at this time. They're actually usually some hybridization of the Chamelot and a Galand, or maybe just a divergent path that looks similar. It's getting into the weeds. We'll stick with what we know. Now, these guns are hard to classify. You can't really pick whether they're like the first modern revolvers or the last antique revolvers. They sit right in that missing link path where some very basic concepts like rebounds and not gate loading just haven't come through. Now, there's not a lot of argument for the rebound, but by the way, I keep harping on, the slow gate loading. I want to make one thing clear. Steel and manufacturing were not completely industrialized as we understand it by the time these guns were out. So it's a little unfair to expect them to have Smith & Wesson style swing out cylinders just because the technology existed in some patent somewhere at that time. Because the metallurgy to do that, no, you'd be looking at cracked parts pretty quickly, especially trying to give it to troops in the field. Gate loaders made sense in their day. I just want to put out that one last little defense of these guns. Anyway, the big question now, and the question for May in just a moment, is whether or not these make do for World War I. I mean, is it enough to have 6 shots real quick of big, slow, and weak? Is that going to be something that you can bank your life on? And I think we need a professional opinion. All right, once more, we made room for May and a pair of rootin' tootin' point and shooties. Now, I guess we kind of have to talk about these in pairs, so
how about the French first?
Yeah, well, let's give you the French, but I'm going to go ahead and lay you out the Italian because realistically, this is the same gun with a different cartridge and slightly different layout. Little control differences. I think we can do this sort of both together through the whole thing. That's fair. So why don't you go ahead and walk us through what it's like to use this, 1873. Remember, the first version of this was available in 1871 as we understand it. It's very old by the time we get to 1914. What's it feel like for an anachronism like this to be on the battlefield, starting with the ergonomics?
All right, guys, Frenchies first. So first things first, when I'm handling this gun, it feels very dense. Like, it feels like there's a lot of weight to this guy and not enough gun, realistically. It feels like there should be more for how much weight there is up here in the cylinder and the barrel. Like, it's ridiculous. All of it's forward. It feels like there's practically nothing back here in the grip, which does actually make it a little bit uncomfortable as far as just holding it out there. I don't know, it just doesn't feel balanced to me. I feel like they could have done better. The grip itself, I do love the angle of it. I feel like maybe they could have taken a little extra time though, maybe like sanded the grips a little bit to match with the gun. That way the ridges aren't sticking out so far. It does make it a little bit uncomfortable as time wears on when you're shooting more and more with it. So just bear that in mind. But still, nice comfortable grip, fits right into the palm of the hand. Not bad, full finger grip also, even for Othais here. The big boys can handle her. Now, as far as loading and unloading on this guy goes, it is a little bit stiff, and this is not an ABD system, so I've got to lower the gate and then put it in a half-cock position because there is no rebound on this, guys. I've got to manually load every single round, close her up, flip her back in, and now she's ready to go. I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous. Like, it feels like it takes forever to load and unload this guy. I really wish they put an ABD system on this at least to give that, just give me that little bit of extra time. But beggars can't be choosers. Overall, she's just a little bit awkward for a revolver. They could have distributed the weight better. She wasn't terrible though. I still performed well enough, but we'll get into the performance in just a moment. Let's talk about the Italian ergonomics. Now, this one just automatically feels better. It feels like the weight is way more balanced. I mean, it honestly feels like it's lighter, which is ridiculous because it isn't. The weight's practically the same. It's just better distributed. You feel the difference when you first handle it, which is nice. And it just looks better too. I mean, it just looks like they took a little bit of extra time. I mean, like, everything just looks sleeker. The grips are a little bit thinner. Like, you're able to get a nice, good grip on. Yeah, that purchase is perfect. That angle is wonderful in your hand. It's really, really a lovely experience. Now, I will say this does have a longer barrel, which does cause me to kind of nose down a little bit. So when shooting, it does cause me to have to realign my sights a little bit faster and easier. Sorry, getting to the shooting a little bit, but I wanted to mention the obvious longer barrel here. It does make an impact, but I'll get a little bit more into that in just a moment. Now, again, loading, same deal as the other one. No rebound, got to be able to go in the half-cock position. When flipping, this one's actually not as bad to flip over, actually. I will say the French one, it does require a significant amount of force to flip this guy over, which it really wasn't easy for me at first. I found I actually weirdly do it better with my left hand, strangely enough. But this guy, for the Italian, he just flips right over there. I do wish they put a little deeper set striations maybe to kind of give you a little more purchase on that, but it's not terrible. Again, it's a slow reload, unload with this guy. No real difference there. Just wish they'd maybe taken a little bit extra time and put an ABD on there. That's about it. But overall for ergonomics, this one's just a little bit sleeker, a little bit neater looking, and the features work a little bit better right now in the ergonomics section. But yeah, it's not bad.
Alright, I will say we're beating the ABD and rebound to death, and truth be told, a lot of you are probably yelling at the screen that it wasn't necessarily available at this moment anyway, so how could they include something that wasn't invented?
Well, yeah, I know. I'm trying to look into the future here. This just shows that the system wasn't as good, that it was a little bit obsolete, which kind of sucks.
It's true. The best systems are future-proof, and if we're complaining about very basic features, then it's not future-proof, at least not until 1914. We're not selling that this is a bad system. At the time, it was an incredibly advanced system. A beautiful system in 1873, 1874. Amazing. We're talking about 1914, so that's why we're sort of beating on it. I just don't want people to think that we're just spitting on it from great height. Like, we're talking about World War I. That's always our context.
And the thing is, if I look in World War I at other revolvers I've shot so far, there are others that do beat it at the moment, which is a little bit rough.
Yeah, again, benefit of coming later on. This is one of the earliest designs we've looked at. I mean, when we talk about the parentage of this gun, we're really looking at maybe like 3-4 years after what's going to be the Gasser revolver. You know what I mean? Like, that's how far back we are now. We are pre Reich's revolver in terms of this thing's development. So we'll give it a little bit of forgiveness, but it doesn't mean that it's going to change our overall opinion of it in the context of the Great War.
God, you reminded me of the Reich's revolver.
Yes, it's a thing that still exists. So nobody's carrying one now.
Thankfully.
Yeah. So might make this look a little bit better, but let's talk about shooting these two. I know, you want to go back to France first?
Yeah, let's do it in order.
Okay, so let's talk about actually shooting these guys, lining up, pulling the trigger, it goes bang. What do you think?
All right, line up my sights. Yeah, you know what? Actually, these are pretty tall for a revolver, so decent job there. The sights, I think, on this one actually line up pretty quickly. I find it as a decent enough point shoot. Like I said, the balance on it does make it a little bit awkward, make it feel a little bit heavier than what it is, so you do have to get used to that as time goes on. Pulling the trigger. Single and double action on this guy are smooth. Like, it is ridiculous. It actually is very pleasant. I mean, don't get me wrong. We clean the guns before we shoot them. Like, we're not just shooting them out of the boxes. People send them covered in gunk. No, we do take care of them. But even saying that, this one was actually more pleasant than what I was expecting. I was totally expecting some snags, maybe a mushy pull through. Nothing. It was actually pretty clean, so I did appreciate that. The recoil, I feel like it did want to flip a little bit. Maybe they could have extended that barrel out. That would have hated with a little bit of that recoil mitigation. But hey, you know, it wasn't terrible. I still shot all right with it. I am going to get into the cartridges in a second, though, but I do want to talk about the Italian a little bit for shooting. Sights, still decent, still tall, like it, love it, live in it. I do feel like this one was a little bit harder to point shoot, and I mentioned it before in the ergonomics. It's just because of the longer barrel. It does want to tip down a little bit, so you just got to make sure, like, pull it up, realign your sights. It just takes a split second longer, and you do notice it. Single and double on this one. Single is actually a little bit rough on this guy. It is smooth, don't get me wrong, but it is heavy. It is very hard to one hand, so some of y'all might have to second hand that. That's some of y'all. Othais here can single hand it pretty easily, and I'm annoyed at him at that one. For me, it's a little bit, yeah, it's definitely harder on my hands. But double on both guns is easy enough for me. Don't get me wrong, both heavy pull-throughs, but both were still smooth, so I did appreciate that. The recoil on this one wasn't so bad. Honestly, I felt like it was, like I said, a more balanced gun, which aided in it. Longer barrel, definitely a plus. I didn't think the recoil was that bad on this one at all compared to it's a French buddy here. But, you know, other than that, not terrible. Now, I did want to get into the cartridges. So we've got 11mm and then we've got 10.4. Honestly, I didn't really feel much of a difference. Like, they're both big, slow, weak cartridges, and they kind of make me nervous. I kind of feel like I don't have a lot of confidence in this one. I mean, like, 4.55 Webley, it's a big and slow load, but I feel like it was strong enough to knock a guy down, whereas these two, I don't know, it's kind of got me guessing. I mean, supposedly this one with 10.4, it's supposed to, on the original loads, have a higher velocity, which should help with that, but I don't know, with what we were able to produce today, we really couldn't see, I couldn't feel much performance difference. So shooting wise, I did all right with them. I could handle them. I can handle my revolvers, but I'm a little bit nervous taking someone down at them.
Actually, I could probably clarify the ammo issue. Can I borrow that?
Sure.
We get this request a lot, is why aren't we shooting ballistics gel? Why aren't we doing ammo tests? You know, that's what everybody wants to see. And believe me, I would really love to do that. But there's a problem, which is that we can't. On-target performance of ammo, a lot of it comes down to the actual makeup of the bullet, let alone the powder. So if we're shooting British ammo, we're not actually using cordite. Well, then the burn rate's ever so slightly different, and the pressure curve is ever so slightly different, and then that's going to change our impact, don't get me wrong, but in the bullet itself, whether it's jacketed with, you know, some sort of copper alloy or malacord or whatever, there's so many different ways to make the bullet, and all of those must be precisely exact across a box of ammo for us to get consistent ballistics gel performance to tell you that that cartridge in that era was better than some other cartridge in that era. It's impossible. The manufacturing behind it would cost us thousands of dollars per set of 5 bullets just to get them into the ballistics gel, so that we could get all these machines and the science behind it. And I don't even want to know about the payroll for the chemistry.
God, that sounds like a whole nother job for C&Rsenal.
No, we're not. I don't even know what the licensing is. So the truth is, we can't just test original ammo against original ammo. And even if we wanted to burn collectible, irreplaceable ammo from the era, which I don't want to do, if we did do that, it's been sitting on a shelf and the powder's aged, and a lot of that powder behaves differently, like we saw in our Gewehr 88 episode. Leave it for 10 years and it evaporates off, and then it changes the performance of the cartridge, and you end up bursting barrels, or it ends up being a dud, or who knows. There's too many variables to get original ammo tested, and so that's why it's very hard to have strong ballistic comparison. We can ballpark our feelings about the general cartridge and general performance. We cannot get you an adequate comparison of, say, like 32 ACP versus 8mm French ordnance. It's just not going to happen.
Sorry, guys.
Sorry. But on to that point, what Mae was alluding to is the fact that, like we said in this episode, the Bodeo kept this cartridge alive longer. That one, well, the 11mm ordnance, it didn't see much evolution after 1890 because it wasn't being used after 1892 as a primary purchased weapon. So with the Bodeo's adoption, though, this guy's 10.4 cartridge, well, it kept seeing some updates, and part of that for smokeless was, like I said, that oddly sort of skirted bullet, which was able to get the muzzle velocity a little higher. We can't make those, so we had to go with a lead round that's a little bit more comparable to the original cartridge, so we're just going to have to stick with that little piece of data. Now, all of that covered, I know that was a lot. There's a slight chance that this has a better cartridge by World War I than what we shot today, but not by much. It's a little oomph, okay? Just a little. It's coming out of a longer barrel, so we'll give it plus 15 points of charisma. Who knows? I don't know.
What's that?
There's a long explanation for it's basically the same thing across the board anyway. So, with that covered, are either of these... Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Are either of these guns acceptable to you in the Great War?
You know, these revolvers are amazing. They really are. They were so much fun to shoot. They're neat little pieces of history. They're like the missing link between a modern revolver and antiques. Really, they are. They were so much fun. I can't give either of them a pass, though. I really can't, because I just can't get over that cartridge. It is big, so weak. I just don't feel like it's really going to protect me or do its job in the war. I mean, maybe if they'd been like 44 Russian or something like that, I'd have barely given them a pass. Even like all the faults, not having an ABD system, being like big and clunky, like I could have passed it, but I can't. That cartridge holds them back too far. So unfortunately, this time around, I'm gonna have to pass on both of these guys. They're gonna have to get a no.
I think that's a fair assessment. Let's run it down. You have a metallic centerfire cartridge, barely. You have none of the redundancies or safeties. Not that that's a huge deal if you're competent with the gun. But you get only 6 shots. They're not super great cartridges. And you get a lead weight on your hip. I'm not saying I wouldn't take it over a shovel.
Oh yeah, no, I would still take that over a shovel.
But we're talking about, pass-fail in terms of feeling confident. That
you could get good with a shovel.
Yes, but... if somebody comes over the trench at you, you go over the trench at somebody, are you going to feel fairly confident in the gun to do its job? I believe it'll go bang. I'm not saying it won't go bang. I'm just saying it's going to be slow, far between. It's going to be awkward. I'm with Mae. Although, I will say personally for me, that I do really love the Italian 1874.
It's so pretty.
It's gorgeous. To my hand, it feels right. And with just a swing out cylinder, it honestly might be like my top pick in the revolver terms. It just feels so good. So for me, actually, I might bank a little on a gun like this. Not a lot, but I have a special place in my heart for the Italian. But that doesn't really put it all the way into the yes category, does it? So, for once, you guys have found the floor for Mae. And
there is a floor. I've said no to others before, and I rhymed.
That wraps up our episode. So catch us next time. And again, stay late for the updates after the credits.
Bye, guys.
Alright guys, I'm going to go ahead and film this update because I kind of know what's going on and we're getting ready to be very, very busy. So, number one, in the course of filming this episode, we got something in the mail as part of a trade deal with a certain ponytailed friend of ours. We've picked up an actual, Chamelot-Delvigne Bodeo. So, this gun was converted, and I'm going to do a special little extra video on it. It's going to be short just to sort of give you a quick walk through the gun. And I'm just going to do it for the patrons. I'll just toss it out there. It's not really all that critical for World War I, but if you guys are even giving $1 on Patreon, we'll get you a closer look. And then as part of that, I wanted to say we've sort of hit a limit to our growth spurt. So I think 77,000 subscribers and some change for a little over a month now.
It's been kind of steadily, little by little.
Well, I see maybe like 100 a week or something, but we're out of spurts. Like we used to get these, we put something out and people would get interested and we get another burst. And so we've put out some interesting stuff lately with the Webleys and things like that, and we haven't seen the usual burst. So we know we're sort of hitting the top of our present market. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. It could be that that is just our market. It might be that you guys watching this now are the people that are going to watch this, or it could be that we've just sort of reached the limits of the media groups that we've been in, the places we've talked, the people we've interacted with. So if you know of someone who hasn't heard of us or who has a format that they would like us to appear on or talk to, we're perfectly happy to talk to anybody. We really like sharing the show, and we like sharing the mission too. At this point, we do have plans to continue the show after World War I, and honestly the show gets a lot easier after World War I for us, but there's a strong determination to sort of get as complete a picture of the war as possible because it really hasn't been done. We're married to the project, like I said. So anything you can do to help us with the project, great. Put us in front of people you know. If you know someone that would like the material, teach Grandpa how to check the YouTubes, okay? Because we want people to watch this. We want it to be consumed. And then, honestly, it does help us to actually grow because each episode is starting to get almost exponentially harder to produce because of the diminishing list and the demands, and you should see some of the weird special stuff we're trying to figure out how to reassemble and repair just so that we can put it in front of the camera. So again, you'll see fewer of these please after we get out of World War I because we'll be able to take stuff as it comes and it will already be working when it comes. We just won't take stuff that's not working. We don't get that choice right now. So all the support we can get, please God, just until we get through the war. And
we love all of you who are supporting us. Thank you.
Yes, it's momentous. And again, don't feel the pressure. I made this announcement on Patreon, and people were like, well, I'll up my donation amount. It's not what I'm looking for. $1 a month is fine. It's really just more about trying to sort of reach more people with the message and show them that there's some interesting history here that they might not be aware of, and they may or may not want to support. Even if we don't get extra support, I would like extra viewers. It's really nice to share all of this since we put so much work into it.
Or if you also want to up your donation, you don't have to listen to the big beardy dude too.
No, don't. $1's fine. All right, so thank you all who have supported the show, for the t-shirts, for the posters, for the Patreon. We try to do our best to make these things interesting for you. And again, it's all going to get lumped into a book just as soon as I have 150 different guns photographed, plus who knows what else to get this all.
The list has gotten a little smaller.
One day, folks. But anyway, thank you all again. Sorry this was so long. And if you're a patron, take a look. I'll have slapped something together for you.
Thanks, guys.